All right. Hello, everyone. Salam, adab, namaste, and welcome to today's event. It's our honor and pleasure that we have Professor CM Naim, a very well-known professor of linguistics and civilization, who taught for a long time at University of Chicago. And I'm not going to do a formal introduction. Rather, we have invited another professor, Dr. Manan Ahmed from Columbia University, who knows his work and him quite well. And it is really an honor that he is here. So, Professor Manan Ahmed, please go ahead and do your opening remarks.
Bahut Shukriya, thank you so much. I'm really delighted, as I said earlier, honored really to be asked to introduce Naim Saab as both as a teacher and as a model for how to do scholarship and live in this world that I've been lucky enough to learn from for so long. I don't think Professor Naim requires too long of an introduction, so I thought I would mention some of the things that we're very familiar with. For example, his Urdu reader and his conversational Hindi Urdu that came out in 1960-62 that really sets the pedagogical kind of footprint for how Urdu became to be taught in the United States. And after that, obviously, around the world, wherever Urdu studies has gathered, these texts have been an important part of it. He was also the co-founder and co-editor of Mehfil with Carlo Coppola, and also the founding editor and publisher of Annual of Urdu Studies, which he led from 81 to 91, which has very recently been resurrected by a new generation of scholars. He's perhaps known outside of the academic world for a number of his translations of very important poets, authors, and perhaps Zikr-e-Mir, which came out originally in 1999 with Oxford University Press, his translation and his annotation. And then very recently, 2019, Harvard University Press's Murti series has reissued it with updated notes and with a dual script volume called Remembrances. And much of Professor Naim's writings can be found through his own site, cmnaim.com, as well as through the incredible resources that Dr. Fran Pritchett has organized on her site. I will drop both of those links in the chat in a second, so people, if they're not familiar with, they can go there and read many of these things. I'm really, really, really excited that something that I've been seeing him work through recently is soon to come into this world, which is his forthcoming book, Urdu Crime Fiction, 1890 to 1950, an Informal History. If you're interested, a chapter, I think, of which, or part of a chapter, came out in I mentioned the Journal of Urdu Studies, The Magic Making Mr. Reynolds and the Development of Urdu Prose Fiction, which came out in January of 2020. So this is sort of a rough sketch of some of his incredible work. I wanted to mention, in fact, 3 essays that have been really, really formative for myself as a student, but also just as a reader. You know, in today's kind of academic parlance, Naim Saab can be categorized as a type of a book historian. He's someone who's kind of really a researcher, not only of how one wrote, but where it was published and the various forms it took for Urdu book history. And 3 of his writings that I have, I mean, every time I read them or I assign them to my students, I discover a new insight. One of the ones is his essay, prize-winning Adab, a study of 5 Urdu books written in response to the Allahabad government gazetteer notification, which originally came out in 1984 and then was reprinted in his own collection in 2004. And that essay, I think, for it's not only for 1984, but for now, is such a model for how to think about print culture, how to think about book history, how to think about colonial and kind of proto-colonial forms of writing and publics. I highly recommend if people are not familiar with it. The second, this is one of my favorite pieces of writing of Naim Saab, is the transvestic words the Rekhti in Urdu, which originally appeared in Annual of Urdu Studies in 2001, and then later on in his, like I mentioned, his collection of his essays and articles, Urdu Text and Context, Selected Essays of CM Naim, which came out in 2004. The Rekhti in Urdu is I think, a remarkable piece of writing because it lays bare the kind of foundations of the ways in which both patriarchal thought, but also misogyny, and how we think about literary cultures can be read through a very, very wide survey of not only English literature, but also drawing upon resources and feminist critiques that were being made in other parts of the kind of literary publics, but Arabic and Persian history. It's something that I think people still get wrong about Rekhti poetry, and it's just like reading it every time I assign it to graduate students. They're like, "Oh, this makes total sense. Why am I reading some nonsense by someone else recently?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's why." And finally, the piece that I think influenced a lot of my own work more recently that I've been writing, which is Saeed Ahmed and his 2 books called Asar Sanadid, which came out in 2010. And that was a piece that I learned about kind of thinking about intellectual history in a particular moment through reading that piece and talking to Naim Saab about that piece, because it allowed me to certainly see with a clarity a moment in time that I had never really paid attention in terms of the people writing about history, writing about their past. And I recently published a book called The Loss of Hindustan, which I dedicated to my 3 teachers, 2 of whom are here, Alam Saab and Naim Saab and Shahid Amin. And it not only because of what they've taught me, but because these examples of concrete historical intellectual work that is a template for my generation of scholars and all other generations to emulate. And I was really delighted this morning when I picked up Naim Saab's Urdu Text and Context book, that book is dedicated to 3 of his teachers. So I didn't know this. It wasn't part of my brain, but I was like, oh, okay. I was really happy to see that. I want to end by saying one part of Naim Saab's incredible range of his intellectual command, that as someone who came from Lahore at a young age to do my undergraduate in this country and have remained here for so long, and as a graduate student, where I think Naim Saab was incredibly influential on that early part of my training, came out in an essay that is on the question of heritage, which is also the topic of today's talk. And in that essay on hijrat, on exile, hijrat, and other ways of kind of understanding the displaced, as he calls in that essay, I want to read just the last bit of it. Naim Saab writes, quote, "In any case, no matter what I call myself, 2 facts stand out. By my presence here, I demand that the host people change their definition of themselves as Americans. And secondly, my presence here requires that I strenuously re-examine and question my Indianness, not only in relation to this country, but also in relation to what I imagine I left behind, as if forever frozen in time." And I think the one way that I've always understood Naim Saab's work and his interactions with me as a student and his peers and his colleagues is this strenuous re-examination, this idea that one is always critically engaging with not only the past, but the present, and finding ways in which we can be more aware of the various baggages, the various hang-ups, the various biases that we carry, no matter who we are, in this context as displaced or migrated or exiled in the United States. So with that, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to introduce my teacher, and I'm looking forward to Naim Saab's presentation. Shukriya.
Thank you, Razi Saab, for inviting me to this wonderful forum. And I can't thank you enough, Manan Saab, for all the kind words and generous words that you have just spoken. And also thank you, by Muazzam, because I won't be able to thank you when you do your duty. So thank you for being part of it. I shall now present my remarks. Sometime in the 1980s, those of us who worked in South Asian studies programs began to meet young men and women of South Asian parentage, but born and raised here, who wished to learn more about their heritage. In fact, they were soon being referred to as heritage students. And since they were all paying good money for their tuition, most programs welcomed them and actively responded to their need. But there were often some problems too, particularly in the areas of political and cultural history, religious studies, and anthropology. The young students and their middle-aged parents were often displeased by what they encountered in academic books and lectures. Since then, I have often thought about this matter of heritage and also written a couple of short pieces to sort out my thoughts. And so when Razi Saab so kindly invited me, I thought it would be a good subject to revisit, chiefly to get fresh feedback from new friends. But I had some fears too, until I learned of a recent pronouncement by Tucker Carlson of Fox News. For then I felt assured that sharing with you my concerns about heritage may not be an absolute waste of your valuable time. According to a recent mailing from the Council for American Islamic Relations, Tucker Carlson has been terribly worried about what he calls the Great Replacement. He believes that President Biden's policies on immigration are designed, I quote, to replace legacy Americans with more obedient people from faraway countries. End of quote. Coverage of Simmons has devotedly pointed out that Carlson had done a nasty cut and paste job on President Biden's words. I was, however, fascinated by his use of the word legacy. Such a curious expression, legacy Americans. That is to say, the Americans to whom the country was bequeathed by the previous generation or generations of Americans. Now, I would like to believe that Carlson includes in that cohort the indigenous people of the great American nations and the people who were once called the Negroes and who now call themselves Black. But I doubt it. It would be most ironical if he did. After all, they are the two people who suffered genocide at the hands of the same legacy Americans that Carlson actually has in mind, but is restrained by his modesty to name explicitly. What is legacy? My simple way of understanding is to count as legacy whatever things, ideas, values, beliefs, cooking recipes I believe my children should receive from me and then hold dear and cherish the whole caboodle all their life. For much of my legacy consists of my heritage, the whole caboodle I received from my elders and have allegedly held dear and cherished all my life. The word heritage, as commonly understood, always has something to do with the birth and the past. I was born in India, and so India and India's past are my heritage. No one here would object if I claim as my heritage the Taj Mahal. But what relationship can I claim to have with Shah Jahan, who financed it, or with Ustad Ahmad, who designed and supervised the construction? Nothing more than a tenuous religious identity. Sahir Ludhianvi, the progressive poet more famous now for his superb film songs, first gained fame for writing a poem denouncing the Taj, calling it a symbol of imperialism. एक शहंशाह ने दौलत का सहारा लेकर हम गरीबों की मोहब्बत का उड़ाया है मजाक. An emperor has used his treasure to make fun of our simple loves. On the other hand, if we recall that Mumtaz Mahal, in whose memory the Taj is said to have been built by a grief-stricken emperor, she died in giving birth to her 13th or 14th child. And so one can also call the Taj a monument to a wife who was literally loved to death by her husband. Would I still take pride in claiming it as my heritage? Rabindranath Tagore called the Taj the frozen tear of a lover. He seems to suggest that all lovers across the world can claim the Taj as their own, as an icon of their own passions. But I would hate to lose my special claim on it, for that is my true comfort. I want something of the Taj to rub off on me and make me a little bit special. The glorious finished object is all that matters to me. Everything else about it, how it came about, it is of little or no consequence. Perhaps the first communal building, that is a building that served an entire speculated community, that South Asian immigrants put up in any American city, was some religious structure. A temple, a mosque, or a gurudwara. A palpable representation of their most cherished heritage, their religion. It was also their big step out of individual living rooms, church basements, and meeting rooms in local libraries. As the new, more splendid structures went up, something else also happened. Up came issues of gender segregation, sectarian exclusiveness, exactitude in rituals, textual authority, and a redefinition of the community from Muslim into Shia and Sunni, Deobandi and Barelvi, Arab and South Asian, Bosnian and Turk, and so forth. Always with invocations of heritage and legacy. The mosques that went up in American cities were seldom integral to their neighborhood as a whole. They were not even like the first mosque I visited in Chicago way back in 1963-64. It was known as the Yugoslavian Mosque on Halsted Avenue. It was a regular commercial building. We performed the Eid prayers in a large hall upstairs, the visitors doing a few things differently from the host, but with no fear of getting ejected because of the difference. We then went downstairs to some festivity in the community center that also contained a bar and served the needs of the entire Yugoslavian community that formed the neighborhood. It is long gone. The neighborhood is now Mexican, The Yugoslavian Muslims have built a gorgeous little mosque in a suburb. It is known as the Bosnian Mosque. But who can say that the old space did not represent a heritage that the earliest Yugoslavian immigrants had felt necessary to cherish and replicate in their new home? There is a Persian couplet by Ghalib that is quite unusual, even for Ghalib. It draws on a theme that, to my knowledge, was never so interpreted by any other South Asian poet in either Persian or Urdu. Baman may always hai bidar, farzande azar ra nigar, har kas ke shud sahib nazar, deene buzurgan khush nakkar. A rough translation would be, don't quarrel with me, father. Look instead at Azar's son. The man who gains a discerning eye does not favor ancestral ways. Ghalib, of course, was alluding here to the patriarch and prophet Ibrahim and his story as described in the Quran, where Ibrahim's father is named Azar. In Old Testament, I think he's called Tehar. Azar, we are told, was the high priest to an idolatrous king and wished to raise his son in the same faith. The boy Ibrahim, however, refused, since he had gained a radically different certitude that was his own. He had gained it as much through his own analytical powers as through God's tacit guidance. This is how the Quran, chapter 6, verses 74 to 79, tells the story. I'm using Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, but I have changed the language a little bit here and there to make it more contemporary. I quote, and when Ibrahim said to his father Azar, you take idols for gods? I see you and your people in manifest error. Then we showed Ibrahim the power and the laws of the heavens and the earth, that he might understand and have certitude. When the night covered him over and he saw a star, he said, this is my Lord. But when it set, he said, I love not those that set. When he saw the moon rising in splendor, he said, this is my Lord. But when the moon set, he said, unless my Lord guides me, I shall surely be among those who go astray. When he saw the sun rising in splendor, he said, this is my Lord, this is the greatest of all. But when the sun set, he said, O my people, I am indeed free from your guilt of giving partners to God. For me, I have set my face firmly and truly towards him who created the heavens and the earth, and never shall I give partners to God. It was this ever constantly questioning, independently thinking, even an iconoclastic Ibrahim that Ghalib celebrated in his verse that I quoted. The Ibrahim who placed his faith in a unique and transcendent God, but only after making full use of his God-given intellect, and who did not hesitate to challenge and repudiate his own father. The much older Ibrahim, the prophet and patriarch of the Bible and the Quran, is very different from the young man. The older man readily abandons a wife and a son in a wilderness to please another wife. And only a divine intervention saved the two. Another time, the same patriarch hastens to sacrifice the same son on account of a vision. And once again, God must directly intervene to avert the calamity. The patriarch unquestioningly submits to what he too readily takes to be God's wish and fails to employ the questioning intellect he had used as a youth. And that unquestioning submission appears to have already become an ingrained legacy to his son, who does not do what the father had done at his age. For Ghalib, Blessed soul was aware of the paradox. He tried to explain it away in another Persian couplet. Farzand zere teghe pedar mi nihat gulu dar khud pedar dar atash namrud mi rabh. The son willingly lays his neck under the father's knife, if the father himself steps into Nimrod's fire. Now here Ghalib is alluding to yet another event in Ibrahim's iconoclastic boyhood, when his father's master, the idolatrous king Nimrod, unsuccessfully tried to kill him by having him cast into a huge bonfire. In other words, Ghalib tells us that an ancestor was worth following unquestioningly only if he had himself risked his life for the sake of his own independently achieved conviction. To my view, that is not a very satisfying resolution. For Ghalib, who celebrated Ibrahim's disfavor of his ancestors' ways, declines to find some way to allow a similar moment of doubt and questioning to Ibrahim's son. Viewed from the perspective of what concerns me, the son in the above story received a legacy from his father, a legacy of faith, but it was not a full legacy, and therefore it was a faulty legacy, or it passed along only what the father had achieved, the certainty of a faith, and left out any mention of the process through which the father had reached that certainty. Tucker Carlson does the same thing. He wants his followers to know and admire only the achieved object, the United States of America as he sees it now. Carlson has no wish to have them learn anything about the process of its making. For example, the law of 1790 that allowed aliens to become naturalized citizens of the new nation after 2 years of residence, but only if they were free white persons. Now that was when George Washington, the father of his nation, had not finished the first 12 months of his first term. Like most legacy holders and worshippers of heritage, Carlson's admirers too prefer not to be reminded of unpleasant matters. We do the same when we claim something as our heritage and pass it on to our children as our legacy, but shy away from the social and historical processes that went into the making of that thing. Doubts, questions, contradictions, contested histories, even errors and mistakes, they are all integral to whatever we presume to proclaim and own as our heritage. No matter how quieting that totality might be. Contrary to what we would like to believe, one is neither born into a tradition nor does one have the privilege to cherry pick one's heritage. One must claim and claim all of it, the good alongside the bad. And the good of any heritage becomes manifest only when we challenge it or allow it to challenge us. Otherwise, one merely basks in its aura and lets oneself be deluded by myths and inventions, which you will agree is a particularly dangerous choice now, given the politics of majoritarianism that are as much raging here as in South Asia. Thank you. now look forward to your comments.
Now I call Muazzam Siddiqui Sir for the concluding remarks. If you are finished, Naim Sir, yeah, all right.
Yes. So it is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to talk about Professor Naim. Every once in a while that we get a person like Professor Naim, a great teacher, scholar, and someone who has taught generations of students. And I cannot think of any person right now who has done so much, especially outside of our homeland, in the cause of not only Urdu language and literature, but also the culture and civilizational aspect of the South Asian heritage. And so it is indeed a great pleasure for me to talk about Professor Naim. I met Professor Naim for the first time in 1968. He left Berkeley in 1961, and I joined Berkeley in the fall of 1965. I had heard a great deal about him, and also I was using the introductory textbook of teaching Urdu and Hindi, which was written among other authors by Professor CM Naim. And also later on, when I was teaching Urdu as a separate language, again, I was fortunate enough to have Professor Naim's book on teaching Urdu to American students. So he has left an indelible mark on the entire history of South Asian studies in the American universities. And also talking about what we call heritage or virsa, I was reminded of opening couplet from the ghazal of Maulana Room, Che tadbir-e Musalmanan ke man khud ra nemi danam, che tadbir-e Musalmanan ke man khud ra nemi danam, Yahudiyam na tarsayam, मजूसी ना मुसलमानम. करूं क्या ऐ मुसलमानों कि मैं खुद को न जानूं हूं, यहूदी हूं न तरसा हूं, मजूसी ना मुसलमान हूं. And in the same vein, the Punjabi poet Bulle Shah had said, Buliya ki jana main kaun. So when it comes to the question of heritage, it is a very complex and very multi-layered discipline to talk about, and especially for people like us who come from South Asia, among the immigrants in this country, and again in South Asia, what kind of Muslim we are, because South Asia is such a huge country, and actually 3 countries now, and whether we are Muslims from the north or the west or the east or the south. So each Muslim, depending upon the area that he or she comes from, has his or her own legacy to talk about and to feel proud about it. So when we talk about, for example, Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, so there is not only the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, but we also have the Godavari Krishna Tehzeeb, and we also have the Kaveri Tehzeeb. So speaking of Kaveri, Iqbal has written a beautiful homage to the river Kaveri, which flows through the town of Srirangapatnam, the capital of Tipu Sultan, and he pays glowing tribute to the Kaveri river and the great civilization that once flourished on the banks of Kaveri River. So what I'm trying to say is we are talking about microcosms within a macrocosm when we are speaking of the question of virsa or heritage or legacy. And then in the case of people like us who have a double legacy, we left our heritage and our legacy behind when we said goodbye to our homeland and when we made United States our adopted country. And then we became fully involved in participating in the activities and all the businesses of life in this country. And then those of us who were married, they had children, their children grew up here and they went to school and they became, started becoming Americanized, but they were confused in quite a bit because at home they were dealing with their parents, they were speaking in Urdu, and their parents, most of them, insisted that they should not give up, especially they should not give up their religion. And then when they went to school, they saw that the classmates were coming from a totally different background. Most of them were Americans and they were speaking English. And at home, their parents, most of them at least, insisted on speaking in their own mother tongue. So they were kind of confused. That was the case of our first generation. And as time went on, luckily, I can say that the second generation, the grandchildren of the people who belong to my generation, they began feeling more at home at school, and they were not caught up in this dichotomy of the two heritages. And still, that stigma still is there, thanks to what happens. We recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and the effects of 9/11 are still there, and they have been in many respects revived due to the recent developments in the politics and other things that were taking place in American life. So the Muslims in general and Muslims of South Asia have a problem of to deal with two legacies. One legacy that we left back home, left behind, and the other one is the legacy that we have inherited living in this country and which we are participating in, which our children are participating in, our grandchildren are participating in. So we have quite a task to undertake. And so I think recently, as I was, as Professor Naim also alluded to it, what is happening in South Asia, as well as what happened in America as a result of the 4 years of the presidency of Donald Trump. And we are still having to deal with that problem. And I don't know how long it is going to take. The problem of what Professor Naim has described as the people who are going to be more faithful to President Biden, as Professor Naim has put it. And we are among the recent immigrants. So we have the responsibility of this double heritage, dealing with our South Asian heritage, our Muslim heritage, and our finer, whether you are a Sunni or a Shia, whether you are a Barelvi or Devbandi, all these differences are still hounding us, and we are not still able to rise above these petty differences. And I don't know really in the true sense. And I am really hopeful that the generation of our grandchildren and the generations follow our, generations to come, only then we can expect that our dilemma with these mixed heritages and with legacies is going to be completely dealt with. And also it raises some questions in my mind, since Professor Naim and some of us are engaged in passing on our linguistic and cultural heritage, teaching the Urdu language not only to American students, but it so happens up until now that a majority of the students who are taking these courses, they are heritage students, the so-called heritage students belonging to the South Asian, heritage. So to what extent the teaching of this language we call Urdu or Hindi or other South Asian languages, and for that matter, other languages that belong to the Muslim or other heritages like Chinese, Arabic, Persian, how long are they going to be taught, and how long the generations belonging to these nationalities are going to keep learning those languages, or is it going to be the same fate that the previous immigrants to America faced? They gradually became part of the melting pot or the salad bowl called America, and they gradually, with generation to generation, they started losing their heritage, their identity, and they completely became part of the American melting pot or the American salad bowl. So this is a question that I would ask Professor Naim and others to discuss when we open, our forum for discussion. And I can't think of any other thing for the time being. So with these brief remarks, and again, with my great pleasure in meeting Professor Naim after probably almost 10 years, that really happy occasion for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mosen Saab. And before we open for question and answer session, this is the announcement for coming week. We are going to have Dr. Qureshi, S.Y. Qureshi, who was the Chief Election Commissioner of India, as well as Director General of Indian TV and all other positions. He is a well-known public figure in India. So we are going to have this coming Saturday.